Evander Holyfield made hundreds of millions, became heavyweight champion 4 times, and was once impossible to avoid. But these days, he rarely gives major interviews and keeps most of his life out of the public eye. One major reason has to do with his health. Let me catch you up. Start with right now. This year in 2026, Holyfield has surfaced in headlines mostly through rumor and speculation rather than his own words. There's been talk of an exhibition bout against Mike Tyson, discussion of another match against a kickboxer, and reports that these events are being lined up for the months ahead. But notice something. None of that talk is coming directly from Holyfield, holding a microphone and telling the world his plans. Holyfield has offered his thoughts on a potential exhibition match between Floyd Mayweather and Mike Tyson. And as he prepares for his first professional outing since 2017, he's reportedly set to enter back-to-back exhibitions against Tyson and Greek kickboxer Mike Zambidis. Reportedly, set to. That's the language surrounding him these days. Other people talking about what he might do next. Earlier this year, there was also a quieter moment that tells you a lot about how he now operates. A supplement company called Terra Origin announced a partnership with the 4-time world heavyweight champion. Holyfield gave a short, polished statement about creatine formulas and clean ingredients. That's it. A brand deal, a few sentences, and back to wherever he came from. Compare that to the version of him who used to fill stadiums and command press conferences that stretched on for hours. The contrast is the whole story. Go back a year before that, to when he was 62. Writers who caught up with him described him as being in incredible condition. 4 years removed from his last time in a ring, Holyfield remained in unbelievable shape at 62. 4 years after he last stepped foot in the ring, someone who has never been one for adding too many pounds in retirement. So this isn't a man who's fallen apart physically and can't show his face. He looks the part. He could still walk into any gym in the country and command respect. And yet he doesn't walk into rooms full of reporters anymore. He doesn't do the press tour thing. He picks his spots. Now rewind further to a magazine profile that captured him away from the cameras entirely in his adopted home near Fort Lauderdale. The writer waited on him. He got lost driving to his own interview. Evander Holyfield is lost, and he's sorry. He was expected more than half an hour ago, but he got turned around, meaning to be at a studio near Commercial Boulevard and Powerline Road. But instead, he's on the phone, apologizing and trying to figure out where he is. That's not the behavior of a man chasing spotlight. That's someone who seems almost uncomfortable being tracked down, being expected, being watched. And when he finally showed up, the description wasn't of a swaggering champion working a room. When he arrives, he's all smiles and apologies. A shy smile, embarrassed, from a man who seems like he'd struggle to fake sincerity. Shy. That word keeps surfacing around a man who once stared down Mike Tyson without blinking. Even Tyson himself noticed it decades ago. Mike Tyson once said of his great rival, "This guy doesn't talk." But the same profile noted that once you get him away from bright lights and shouting press conferences, a different person shows up. Someone who'll talk for hours if the subject is his mother, his childhood, his faith. Get Holyfield away from bright lights and shouty press conferences, and a kind, natural storyteller emerges. One who unfailingly returns the story to his mother, who made him what he is and who he misses every day. So here's the picture starting to form. This is a man who was never entirely comfortable in the glare to begin with, who built a public persona because the sport demanded it, and who, once that demand disappeared, retreated to something closer to his natural temperature. But that alone doesn't explain years of scarcity. Shyness doesn't erase you from television screens for a decade. Something heavier did that. Because there was a stretch of time when Holyfield wasn't just quiet by choice. He was quiet because his life had become something he didn't want photographed. There was a period when reporters chasing him weren't calling about fights or motivational speeches. They were calling about court dates, about a mansion with moving trucks parked outside it, about a bank account that had gone from 9 figures to barely 6. There was also a stretch when the cameras that did find him caught something that made people wince, not because he looked broke, but because of how he sounded. Slurred words, sentences that trailed off and didn't come back. The kind of thing that makes an entire arena go quiet before a fight, because everyone's thinking the same question and nobody wants to be the one who says it out loud. Even in July of this year, the internet ran with a story that he had died, a hoax that spread fast enough to convince nearly 1 million people to click like on a memorial page. Before his team stepped in to shut it down, News of boxer Evander Holyfield's death spread quickly, causing concern among fans across the world, before the report was confirmed as a complete hoax, with the five-time world heavyweight champion alive and well. Think about why a death hoax about him spreads that easily in the first place. It spreads because people don't see him often enough to know for certain that it isn't true. Silence creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with rumor. So the question isn't really, is he hiding in some cartoonish, locked doors sense? He shows up for the right paycheck, the right partnership, the occasional quote about a Tyson rematch. But the version of Holyfield who used to be unavoidable on every talk show, every magazine cover, every Wheaties box, that version has been retired for a long time now, and retired well before his boxing license technically was. To understand why, we have to go back to the peak of his earning power and watch, step by step, how it slipped away from him. Because money, or the loss of it, turns out to be the first and biggest piece of this puzzle. Let's talk numbers, because the scale here is almost impossible to process. Over a 26-year professional career, Holyfield generated something in the range of $230 to $250 million in prize money alone. The 1997 rematch against Mike Tyson alone put $34 million in his pocket, and by the time he retired, he had collected somewhere between $230 and $250 million in prize money. Across a 26-year career, that single Tyson rematch, the infamous one, paid him more than most people will earn across 3 lifetimes combined. And today, multiple outlets tracking his finances land on roughly the same figure for what's left. About $1 million. Today, his estimated net worth sits at roughly $1 million, a gap between $230 million earned and $1 million remaining. That makes his financial story one of the most striking in sports history. That's not a man who overspent on a few vacations. That's a fortune that essentially evaporated. So where did it go? Start with the house, because the house tells the whole story in miniature. Holyfield built an estate outside Atlanta that became almost a punchline for excess. 50,000+ square feet, over 100 rooms, a bowling alley, a movie theater. The home, located on Evander Holyfield Highway, had 109 rooms, including 17 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, and a bowling alley. It sat on well over 200 acres, and keeping the lights on in a place like that isn't cheap. The mansion sat on 235 acres with 11 bedrooms, 17 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, a 2-lane bowling alley, and a 135-seat theater. And maintenance costs alone were reported at $1 million per year. $1 million a year just to maintain a house. That's before mortgage payments, before taxes, before staff. And the mortgage itself was enormous. Holyfield had borrowed roughly $10 million against the property through Washington Mutual Bank, and when his income slowed after his fighting prime, he couldn't keep up. Holyfield defaulted on a $10 million loan to Washington Mutual Bank, which auctioned off his home on the courthouse steps, as his estate was set to be auctioned at public outcry to the highest bidder for cash at the Fayette County Courthouse. That first foreclosure attempt in 2008 wasn't even the end of it. The house went in and out of trouble for years afterward. And by the time it was finally taken, the debt attached to it had ballooned. Holyfield lost the residence to foreclosure because he could not satisfy a reported debt of $14 million, and a bank purchased the property for $7.5 million. Do that math. He owed nearly double what the bank eventually recovered by selling it. The gap didn't disappear, it just became another line on a very long list of debts he was carrying. And the house wasn't the only front he was fighting on. There was a landscaping company out of Utah that took him to court over more than $500,000 in unpaid bills. A federal lawsuit was filed seeking repayment of $550,000 in loans, allegedly made to Holyfield to pay for landscaping on his estate. There was the IRS, which had him on its list of people behind on federal taxes. Holyfield's money troubles ranged from child support, non-payment for his 11 children, to landing on the IRS deadbeat list for delinquent taxes, plus divorce costs and bad money management. And there was child support, a recurring, public, humiliating thread that ran through nearly every year of his post-boxing life. One case in particular became a national story. The mother of one of his children took him to court over missed payments, and the number attached to the case eventually climbed into the hundreds of thousands. He was held in contempt of court after failing to pay child support of around $372,097.4 that later climbed to $563,900.91. A judge overseeing a separate, much smaller case put the disparity in blunt terms, pointing out that ordinary people making a fraction of what Holyfield had earned were going to jail over missed payments, a fraction of the size his case involved. The judge said he would request the boxer be jailed if he didn't pay up, adding, "This is such a small amount given the scope of what he has. If Evander Holyfield can get away with it, anybody can. There are guys making $15,000 a year who go to jail for missing a $100 payment to dig out from under all of it." Holyfield started selling the physical proof of his career. Not stocks, not property. He could easily replace actual pieces of his legacy. Following the bank's foreclosure, Holyfield sold numerous prized possessions at auction. His Olympic bronze medal, 20 pairs of fight gloves, championship rings and belts to cover debts and obligations. Picture that for a second. The medal from the Olympics that launched his entire career gone to a bidder to help pay off a landscaping bill. By 2012, one major outlet had a blunt label for where all this had landed him. The Independent described Holyfield that year as flat broke and bankrupt, despite having made a hefty sum of $513 million over his decade-long boxing career. That figure includes pay-per-view revenue tied to his biggest fights, not just his personal purse, but the point still lands. This was a man connected to more money than most corporations see, and he was being described in the same sentence as broke. Bankruptcy attorneys who looked at his case afterward noted something almost darkly comic about the scale of it. His secured debt was so large that ordinary bankruptcy protection wasn't even available to him. Filing Chapter 13 stops foreclosures, but if you have more than $1,081,400 in secured debt, you can't file Chapter 13 bankruptcy. Instead, you have to file Chapter 11. He was too far underwater for the standard lifeline most Americans use. Now think back to Part 1. The version of Holyfield who apologizes for getting lost on his way to an interview, who seems almost embarrassed by attention. Layer a decade of courthouse notices, auction houses, and IRS letters on top of that personality, and you start to understand why a man might stop returning calls from reporters. Every headline during those years wasn't about a fight he won. It was about a bill he couldn't pay. Nobody wants a camera in their face during that. Financial collapse doesn't just cost money. It costs a person's willingness to be seen. And for Holyfield, it coincided with something else that made cameras even more dangerous: the way he'd started to sound whenever he opened his mouth. If the money explains why Holyfield might want to avoid cameras, his voice explains why he might genuinely need to. Because starting in the years after his boxing career wound down, every time footage of him talking circulated, a familiar wave of concern followed it. The moment that crystallized it for a lot of people came in 2021, right before his comeback fight against Vitor Belfort. He was 58 years old, stepping in on short notice after Oscar de la Hoya pulled out sick. And in the lead-up interviews, something was clearly off. Holyfield gave fans further cause for concern after slurring worryingly during an interview ahead of the fight, with concerns continuing to be raised over his health after he looked sluggish during his media workout, and at times he was incoherent as he answered questions. Watch that clip, and you can hear it for yourself. Sentences that start strong and then lose their shape halfway through. Words that don't land where you expect them to. He stuttered through an answer. I said, so I asked him the question, how in the world did this guy go? Do this with Oscar, then come do this with me. I said, does he know that we are different? I said, well, it's okay. He's good. That's not a rehearsed soundbite going sideways. That's someone visibly working to hold a thought together. Boxing outlets picked it up almost immediately, and the framing was consistent across nearly every one of them. An interview given ahead of the official press conference and face-off with Belfort further increased the concern held by many fans, as Holyfield displayed worrying, slurred, and incoherent speech during the interaction. This wasn't a one-off tabloid story. It was treated as a real, ongoing health story sitting right next to the sports coverage. And the fight itself didn't do anything to calm those nerves. Holyfield had stepped in despite a long absence, but in hindsight, it wasn't the right decision. He was dropped to the canvas within seconds and was far too slow, as Belfort took advantage and dominated him. A fighter who once absorbed some of the hardest punches in heavyweight history went down almost immediately against an opponent 14 years his junior. For anyone already worried about what decades in the ring had done to him, that fight looked less like a sporting event and more like confirmation. This wasn't a new conversation, either. Years before Belfort, boxing forums and fan communities had already been noticing the same pattern. In his interviews and quietly comparing notes, Holyfield was never the best talker, but people online observed that his speech had deteriorated a lot since his boxing days. The kind of thing that starts as a comment thread and eventually becomes an accepted, sad piece of boxing knowledge. That a certain roughness in a fighter's voice, years after retirement, usually means something. People who follow the sport closely have a name for it, informally, that boxer's slur. The specific cadence that shows up after a career of absorbing head trauma. Fans discussing his interviews noted he seemed to be developing that boxer's slur that happens to a lot of fighters who took a lot of punishment, with boxers who are damaged usually running their words together more than outright slurring. Commissions have used exactly this kind of evidence before, to keep aging fighters out of the ring entirely, comparing new interview audio against recordings from a fighter's prime to measure how much things have changed. Nevada set a precedent by vetoing an application after hearing a fighter's slurred speech and comparing it with an audio recording from earlier in his career. None of this means Holyfield has been formally diagnosed with anything specific in public, and it's important to be careful here. There's no confirmed medical record circulating publicly that names a condition, but the pattern of concern, spread out across more than a decade of interviews, from strangers on forums to professional boxing journalists to the athletic commissions that regulate the sport, is consistent. Something changed in how he communicates, and it changed in a direction that worried the people who noticed it. Now put yourself in his position for a second. You spent your entire adult life being celebrated for your voice as much as your fists. Quotable, engaging, a natural storyteller, as that Fort Lauderdale profile called him. Then you start noticing that every time you're on camera, comment sections fill up with people asking if you're okay, if you've had a stroke, if boxing finally caught up with you. That's not a small thing to sit with. That's the kind of thing that would make almost anyone start turning down interviews they don't have to do. Compare that to what he sounds like in the settings he does still choose. The Terra Origin partnership statement from earlier this year, for example, reads clean and coherent. Him expressing being impressed with the commitment to purity and performance in a supplement's creatine formula, and noting that for athletes and anyone serious about their fitness goals, choosing the right fuel makes all the difference. That's a written statement, of course, not unscripted speech. But it's notable that the appearances he's kept up in 2026 tend to be exactly that. Controlled, brief, low risk, not sprawling live interviews where a stumble gets clipped and shared a million times. Curated moments. That's a strategy, whether it's conscious or not. And it lines up perfectly with a man. And it lines up perfectly with a man who has reason to be careful about how he's heard as much as how he's seen. So now we've got two separate, heavy reasons pulling Holyfield away from the spotlight. The financial collapse that turned every headline into a humiliation, and the physical toll that turned every interview into a risk. But there's a third piece to this, one that's less about crisis and more about who he's always been underneath the champion persona. Because long before the money trouble, and long before the slurred interviews, there were signs that Holyfield was never entirely built for the fame that came with being the best heavyweight on the planet. Here's a detail that gets lost in the highlight reels. Holyfield has been married 4 times and has 11 children. Holyfield has been married 4 times and has 11 children. 11 kids means 11 separate relationships with mothers, 11 sets of school events, birthdays, needs, and, as we already covered, 11 potential threads of child support obligation running through his finances at any given time. That's not a footnote. That's a second full-time responsibility layered on top of a boxing career and a media career. And it's one that doesn't pause when the money gets tight. Multiple financial breakdowns of his post-career struggles point to exactly this as one of the sustained drains on his fortune. Another major factor shaping an athlete's net worth is long-term personal obligations. Divorce costs, child support, and ongoing financial responsibilities create a permanent outflow that doesn't care whether a boxer is still earning at championship level. 11 children means that outflow never really shrinks, even as the paychecks did. But strip away the financial angle for a second and look at the emotional one, because it connects directly back to why Holyfield seems to retreat, rather than lean into public life. That Fort Lauderdale profile kept circling back to one figure who shaped him more than any opponent, any promoter, any commission ever did. His mother, Annie Laura Holyfield. Evander Holyfield loves his mother. Annie, Laura Holyfield, is no longer with us, but her famous youngest child is doing his part to keep her memory alive. The picture that emerges from people who've spent real time with him is of someone whose public toughness was almost a costume, laid over a much softer, more private person. Someone his mother had specifically shaped to avoid exactly the kind of showboating that fame usually rewards. She shielded him and guided him, shooing away other family members at times, and deciding which influences got close to him. That's a mother building a wall around her son, not preparing him to court an audience. Even his sense of home reflects that same instinct to stay rooted rather than chase the spotlight. Despite the mansion, despite the fame, when asked about where he's from, the answer isn't glamorous. "I grew up in Atlanta," he says. "I didn't ever think I would leave Atlanta." Leaving, he felt, meant deserting. That's the language of loyalty, not ambition. And it tracks with where he's ended up now, not chasing bigger stages in bigger cities, but staying close to the region that raised him. Financial trackers, looking at his current situation, echo the same theme. Evander Holyfield is believed to still live in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and has kept a relatively private life in recent years, often staying close to where he built his former Fayetteville estate. Not a new mansion somewhere flashier, not a relocation to chase new business opportunities in Los Angeles or New York. He stayed near the wreckage of his old life, geographically speaking, rather than running from it. The foundation work adds another layer here, because it's some of the only public activity he's kept up consistently without needing cameras to validate it. The Evander Holyfield Foundation is a non-profit organization that assists underprivileged children with educational support, mentorship programs, and financial aid. That's not a red carpet charity gala circuit. That's the kind of quiet, sustained work that doesn't generate headlines on its own. And that suits a man who, according to nearly everyone who's profiled him closely, was never chasing headlines to begin with, even at the absolute peak of his fame. There's also his son, Evan, a boxer in his own right, whose recent health scare gives a small window into how this family operates outside the public eye. Evan Holyfield underwent heart surgery to correct a problem that could have not only ended his career, but also his life. And speaking as he recovered, he said he wanted to return to boxing as soon as possible. Notice how little fanfare surrounded that. A genuine medical crisis for a member of one of boxing's most famous families, handled mostly through a single trade publication interview rather than a media circus. That's consistent with everything else here. A family that deals with its hardest moments privately, even when the name attached to them practically guarantees attention if they wanted it. Put all of this together with what we already covered. A man raised by a mother who deliberately shielded him from outside influence and taught him humility over showmanship. A man whose natural personality, according to people who've spent real time with him, is shy and easily embarrassed rather than performative. A man managing 11 children's worth of relationships and financial obligations quietly rather than through public statements. A man who stayed rooted near his hometown even after losing the biggest physical symbol of his success. None of that is the profile of someone who was ever fully comfortable being the most famous heavyweight boxer alive. He did it because the sport required a public figure, and once the sport was done with him, the public figure part of him went right along with it. That brings us to where things actually stand today. Not the myth of a man in hiding, but the reality of a man who's built a much smaller, much more selective public life for himself, and what that life actually looks like from the outside in 2026. So where does all of this leave him now, at 63 years old? The picture isn't of a man locked away somewhere, unreachable. It's of a man who's become extremely deliberate about when and why he steps into view. the financial reality hasn't dramatically reversed. Estimates from this year still put his net worth at roughly the same place it sat for years. Evander Holyfield will turn 63 in 2026, and his net worth is estimated at $1 million. He earns through public appearances, selective endorsements, and motivational speaking, rather than through anything resembling his old fight purses. His current relationship status is single, and he's focused on his post-boxing life and motivational speaking. That's a modest, manageable income stream, but it's one that requires him to show up for the right, controlled opportunities. A supplement deal here, a speaking engagement there, rather than the chaotic, unmanageable spotlight of his championship years, and the comeback chatter that keeps surfacing. The Tyson exhibition talk, the Mike Zambides rumors, hasn't been coming from a man actively campaigning for attention. It's been filtered through TMZ producers and secondhand reporting, with Holyfield himself weighing in only when asked directly. Their planned, non-competitive tussle was reportedly targeted for earlier in the year before scheduling shifted, with the 49-year-old, referring to Tyson, reportedly set to enter back-to-back exhibitions, a plan suggested by a TMZ sports executive producer rather than confirmed directly by either fighter. That gap between what's rumored about him and what he's actually said himself is, by now, the defining feature of his public presence. Even the health conversation hasn't disappeared. It's just moved into the background, rather than dominating every headline the way it did around the Belfort fight. People who watched him at 62 came away impressed by his physical condition, which suggests whatever caused those slurred interviews wasn't a broader physical collapse. It's something narrower, tied specifically to speech, that he seems to have learned to manage, or at least avoid triggering, in the settings he now chooses. Holyfield remained in unbelievable shape at 62, and looking at his physique, he could possibly have been in better condition than when he fought Belfort in 2021. That's really the through line connecting everything we've walked through. This isn't a mystery with one dramatic answer. It's three separate pressures that all pushed in the same direction at roughly the same time. The money collapsed publicly and humiliatingly, turning every news cycle about him into a story about debt rather than glory. His speech changed in a way that made unscripted, extended camera time genuinely risky rather than just uncomfortable. And underneath both of those crises was a man who, by his own family's design and his own admitted nature, was never entirely built for constant exposure in the first place. Someone who apologizes for being late and gets embarrassed by his own smile. None of that means Holyfield vanished. He's still out there. He's still doing the Wheaties box version of himself. When a good, controlled opportunity comes along, still weighing in on Tyson Mayweather questions when reporters ask. Still running a foundation that quietly helps kids without needing a camera crew present. What changed is the ratio. How much of his life happens in public versus how much happens away from it. In his championship years, that ratio was almost entirely public. Now it's flipped dramatically toward private. There's something almost fitting about how the mansion story ended, in that respect. The house that symbolized his overexposed, excessive fame eventually sold to another famous name entirely. Reports connect the property's later ownership to entertainer Rick Ross. In 2014, the mansion was purchased by Rick Ross for $5.4 million. The physical symbol of Holyfield's most public chapter now belongs to somebody else's public chapter. He kept the memory and the lesson. He let go of the spotlight that came with it. And maybe that's the most honest way to understand a man who once couldn't walk through an airport without being mobbed, and who now gets lost trying to find a studio 30 minutes from his own house. It's not that he's hiding from anyone specific, and it's not that he's incapable of showing up. It's that showing up used to be automatic, a condition of being the champion, and now it's a choice. One he makes carefully, on his own terms, for reasons that add up to exactly what we've walked through. A fortune he had to watch disappear in public. A voice he learned he couldn't fully trust on camera. And a temperament that was never quite as loud as the man swinging punches under the lights. The champion is still in there. He's just decided the world doesn't need to see all of him anymore. Only the parts he's ready to give it.